So welcome to the Business Sense with Brad podcast. My guest today is Dr. Mark Cawman. We were in a doctoral program together and we both love quality management. And today we're going to talk about Six Sigma process improvement and fails. It's always good to talk about what fails and if it's, Six Sigma's fault or our fault. Usually I think it's more on the latter, but we blame the Six Sigma, as I've seen done before, or it could be maybe it wasn't Six Sigma wasn't set up for what we were trying to improve. So anyway, welcome, Mark, or do you want me to call you Dr. Mark?
Oh, and Mark is absolutely fine.
And Mark has a book, so let's talk about that really quick. You talk about a lot of these things in that book, I'm sure.
Yeah, I do. I wrote a textbook, primarily kind of an exercise and case study book, mostly because of the fact that even in some of my own classes that I teach, I really found out that there was the case studies at the end of the chapters did not really engage the students well. And you can go out and buy Harvard course packs and so forth and so on. And for the price that you pay to get 5 or 6 cases, they're short stories that basically the professor still has to try to figure out what to do with. So mine actually have quite a bit of guided dialogue throughout, present a real dilemma, give them something to chew on. And so we wrote the book not necessarily as a specific discipline case or set of cases, but rather tried to cover a number of different things that might occur in classes. So it's called Global Business and Marketing Strategy, Integrated Workbook of Exercises and Case Studies. And so one of the things is that every chapter is somewhat standalone. So as opposed to like maybe an international business textbook that starts kind of at the beginning and is a progressive and thematic progress throughout, and or strategy or something else. This, it has a chapter on strategic planning and has a case study at the end. And so the preamble of the gives a quick overview of strategy and then finishes with a good case study. The same thing with a number of different other things. So it takes on subjects from ranging from CSR to marketing to strategy and so forth. So usually in any given class, if I'm teaching strategy, if I'm teaching international business, if I'm teaching marketing, there's a good 6 or 7 chapters that will apply. And that really kind of competes with a Harvard course pack set that you might buy. And then you use those. And then obviously, in some ways you could actually reuse the book in another class with a completely different set. So that was the intention of it. And so a lot of those case studies, some of them are, really researched into specific companies. Some of them with 26 years in industry may or may not resemble something I've done in the past, and so forth and so on. But that's really what that book was. And so, yes, certainly
Uh,
does play into several of those things.
Awesome. We could find that on Amazon, I'm sure, or the somewhere
Yeah,
else.
so they ran the preliminary edition this past year and gave it to the authors to prove out in their class. So it was published, ISBN number, and so forth, but it was not widely marketed. And then all of the changes are in, and so this summer that's coming out in first edition, and as you say, we'll hit the open market. So.
Awesome. Okay. So before we get in here, let's start with two broad questions. What's the difference between Six Sigma and Lean? But then I also want to say, is it fatted out or is it coming back or is it stayed the same? So let's start off when we're talking Lean Six Sigma. And if someone's listening and they're like, I might have heard it, but I don't really know what that is. Could you tell us what that is?
Yeah, so a lot of times people will say the words Lean Six Sigma and maybe just use that as sort of a hyphenated word that people believe is one and the same. The reason that it's kind of one and the same is similar to the word OpEx or operational excellence. So they've identified the fact that they're doing improvement within their organization, and so they sort of hybridize that word. The reality of it is those are two separate things. So the lean Six Sigma is the removal of waste in your organization, and that waste includes everything, as we know, the forms of muda or Japanese muda. They remove their efficiency. They streamline the process. They look at a value stream map. They take out as much non-value as they can. And then they look at literally trying to take out motion and time and waste and overproduction and all of those different kinds of things. Even within lean, then there's other subsets, such as kind of the organization and housekeeping aspect of it that sets it up is a lot of times the 5S program or something like that. And so lean is sort of that kind of productivity efficiency side. And Six Sigma was originally more of a problem solving. And so Six Sigma comes out to be there is two definitions for Six Sigma. One is it's a programmatic tool, and the second is it's a statistical tool. So on the statistics side, what Six Sigma is when you arrive at Six Sigma, that is the statistical arrival at zero defects. So if you think about like a CPK level or a different sigma level, there's a certain percentage of defects per million or a percent of defects. And when you get down to 0.0000 and carry that completely out, then you are at Six Sigma. A quick visual of maybe how Six Sigma can look without having to learn all the formulas is if you take the entire variation and put it under a bell curve. And so you have this bell curve and all your variation is there. And then you have your upper and lower control limits on a particular maybe product dimension or something, and those are out here. If you could take and you take your total variation and center it in your tolerance, if you could take that bandwidth and fit it 3 times to the near to each limit, and take that variation band and fit it 3 times each side, you would be at Six Sigma. It means you're not close to a limit, and you've narrowed your variation enough that you're not going to have these tails on a histogram or bell curve that's basically giving you a lot of defects. So if you kind of use that visual of the fact that I've got this narrow barrel bell curve and I've got these wider tolerance parameters, and so I've got room to go 3 on each side, picture that as Six Sigma. So Six Sigma is the statistical level to get to quality. Now, what ended up happening is people started to say, how do we get there? And so they started to create the programmatic Six Sigma, which we know as the DAMIC process, the define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. And it was a defined problem-solving methodology. So Six Sigma is problem solving to try to get to Six Sigma level quality in your organization. And your lean is the other. And so a lot of times when you hear those two things rolled out, Lean Six Sigma, you're trying to really eliminate the waste and defects in your organization. And then you're also trying to, with the lean side, work on your value stream.
Well, that might be the best definition I've heard of it. So, yeah, and it's hard to define to someone too that has never worked on a process before or has tried to even has because a lot of the stats are actually pretty straightforward. Like, what's the mean of the process, the average? We probably learned that in elementary or middle school, and then we're talking standard deviations, which gets a little more complicated. So once you start hitting standard deviations, people start tuning out, and then, but really, if you could keep the deviation, because there's the all of that within the what the customer defines or what your spec is. You can keep all of the variation within that, but it's super expensive and nearly impossible to do. But that's kind of the idea behind Six Sigma. So it's not super complicated, but I think people when they try to define it, it could get, I don't know, especially if you don't have any of the statistical background. As soon as you hear sigma or standard deviation, you might tune out.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I mean, if you just, as simple as in Excel, create some columns of your issues and get it to the point where you can have it under a bell curve, and then you put your tolerance on both sides, most people can pretty easily kind of do that visual of, do I have room for that bandwidth, +3, -3, and that starts to basically make some sense for them.
So if I was going to give this a quick definition, imagine we make doors and the making of the door, we get rid of a lot of the waste. So however that is from how we harvest the wood or like our supplier or whatever, and we have less waste as far as how it gets to be flattened and all of those things, and we keep improving the process. At some point, it'll be just little minor increments, but at first we probably find a lot of waste. That would be the lean side, and then making it so that door fits 100%, and we're assuming the frame's perfect, that fits every time. That would be the Six Sigma side of it. Is that a good explanation?
Yeah, and so the concept of lean with the waste is really fun because when people try to define it, they used to have the 7 and an 8 and various types of maybe levels of muda, or Japanese term for waste. And I remember I was at a conference, and the speaker told me that he was interviewing a Japanese sensei, Yamamoto-san, and the guy comes running in one morning, all excited, and he wrote on the board this formula: I minus C equals W. And he said that solves everything. And the guy was like, what's it mean? And he says, forget about trying to define how many different forms of waste or muda there is or anything else. He said, I is the ideal state and C is the current state. Anything that's different between the ideal state and the current state is waste. Work on those things. Constantly work to try to get the current state to the ideal state. So it's a much broader definition. So when you look at that, it can be something as simple as, we've all seen like maybe spaghetti maps or something where we're tracking how many steps somebody did to basically get a product from one point to another, when it could be better co-located, seeing some type of a defect, maybe some type of overproduction where now we have some obsolescence or whatever. But he just basically said, expand that to the fact of we're trying to work toward that ideal state where we literally have no non-value, and everything is producing value, and try to work toward that. So I minus C equals W is, I guess, the broader definition there of waste.
Yeah, I always say like the eighth new waste is like waste of human or talent or whatever, but it's like the seven habits of highly effective people, and then like you need an eighth one because you're contracted for two books, so he comes out
Yeah,
with an eighth habit.
exactly.
It's kind of we're so process focused, and we're like, we need an eighth one. What about the people? We'll throw that in there. Then the next one there might be a the secret ninth waste. So
Yeah,
I like the
not using
simplicity.
AI would be the ninth one or something. So
Yes, yeah, I love it. So I guess in this AI era, and again, Six Sigma, brief history in a nutshell. Ford Taylor working at Ford or whatever, they get the factory and all of their processes running super efficiently. That eventually influences Toyota and the Japanese, like let's say in the 40s and 50s. Deming comes over and helps them with their industries, especially Toyota. His work's based off Shewart from the 20s. Long story short, we take all of these ideas that originated in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They go through the Toyota process or whatever. Then they get to the US in the 80s because we're behind on quality, and I guess Motorola adopts it or what have you. And then, of course, in the US way, we have to put belts to things. Like when we're learning karate, when my kid's learning karate, they force him to pay, or he used to. He's not karate anymore. Every 2 months, you got to belt up and pay for it. In the U.S., we love our belts, and we're in the Japanese. We're like, this is a way of life. You don't need a belt for improvement. But anyway, I love the difference in culture. Lots of stuff here. But long story short, the 80s it takes hold here. The belt system emerges, all of that. So now we're in 2024. What are your thoughts on the legitimacy or relevance of Six Sigma today, knowing it's, basically took hold here in like the mid 80s?
well, I think one of the things we have to do is go back and kind of to the maybe the tenet of your show here today, or your talk, and that is look at some of the mistakes and then see kind of how some CEOs are reacting to that today. Um, so, I remember in the early 90s when GE was, as an example, in the appliance world, they were doing a lot of the Six Sigma. And so they hired these very, individuals that got their black belts and were touting themselves as, pretty much walking on water within the plant. And everybody, was bowing to them as the senseis, and they were making all these improvements, and they were touting all of these particular results. So a couple things that happened. One is it took a few years, but eventually everybody realized, and I have this acronym called DID, and it literally stands for did it drop, meaning did it make the bottom line? And the short answer is no. So they would have these, all of these savings that they claimed, and they would demonstrate it within a particular focus area. But at the end of the day, when it rolled up to the aggregate, P&L of the organization, they didn't really see the needle move. And what you saw was that a lot of times some of these Six Sigma efforts, some of these lean efforts, some of those so forth that would take place would literally sort of either move the inefficiency kind of like a rat. It would just move it to a different area of the snake and take credit for their specific area. And so that was really a kind of a big fault, is that it was not necessarily followed through. And so, a lot of CEOs today are starting to basically say, I don't really want buzzwords within my organization of, TQM or Lean Six Sigma or any of these other types of things. The reality of it is I want to see, somebody that's skilled in all of it, in various areas of my organization. And, it shouldn't be the fact that I have a hammer so everything looks like a nail, but rather, what is the particular situation, and our people should be skilled enough. And really what we should do is start with the bottom line and work our way backwards. And, the reality of it is if you only do 3% to 3.5% of productivity improvements in your organization in a particular year, you've actually not done anything, because you've already probably given away cost of living increases. You've already seen your supplier, so forth and so on. And we know this is inflation. So you've got to get over that 3% or so. And the last year or two, obviously, more than that. But on an average, you try to get over that 3% before you actually start making significant headway to EBITDA lift. Anything else is really just an offset to inflation. So throughout the DNA of your organization, you need productivity and improvement. And so some people are starting to lean more into that than having, I guess you would say, just a specialist. Now, the reality of it is it still takes a specialist to basically go throughout the organization and train people how to do that. So those jobs aren't necessarily going away, but they're becoming a little bit less programmatic or project of the month, or named as something just fun and cute.
Well, yeah, when I did my green belt back in like 2011, and I was a quality engineer, but we didn't. Again, I worked directly with the Japanese. I was in Denso, which is a supplier to Toyota. They didn't really care about, like we just talked about culture-wise, they didn't really care about Six Sigma per se. They're like, we live this. And so I didn't necessarily take on like the project charter and following the DMAIC perfectly, but I implemented a lot of the tools from Six Sigma to do improvements as part of the way of life. And I don't know if that's kind of what you're saying, but I think, again, I think it's this culture thing, because the Six Sigma ideas are relevant, but the way it's practiced is, oh, I jumped through the hoop and got my black belt. I could go do this now, but it's like, it's got to be a way of life. And of course, upper management, as Deming would say, has to be on board. It's got to be like a culture shift. And so, again, hiring people like consultants have this issue a lot. Like they could come in and save us, and then they can walk out, and then it reverts back to its state. So, I would say, and I always say this too, like I'm teaching a yellow belt class right now, and I would say, these principles, you don't just learn them, get the belt, and you're done. Like this, it should help you make improvements, but without that culture shift, and then also thinking in systems, like I made this process better, but that doesn't happen in a silo. It affects other processes. Maybe the waste got moved there. So again, I don't know. I love the tools, but I think we could get one, hyper focused, and two, it has to be an organization wide thing. So I don't know. I'm kind of rambling, but thoughts on that?
No, you're absolutely right. I spent, my career was divided in fours. So I spent in four pieces. So I started in automotive, and I started really in direct supply to Ford, GM, and Chrysler. And so heavy SPC, a lot of statistical models, so forth and so on. And then moved into 100% Toyota supply. And so we literally were a Japanese owned company right next to the Toyota plants. We'd hire retired Toyota engineers, learned the Toyota production system, spent a lot of time. We're doing standard work and so forth. Then I took those tools and went to aerospace, and I spent my career for really the next almost 15 or 16 years. I spent in aerospace, and then now I'm teaching those things in academia. So, but that's sort of been, I guess you would say, the where that's gone. Um, it's been interesting too, because I think where you see that is, GM was trying to, the GM Ford Chrysler model back then was trying to use statistics to basically predict everything and catch it before things went out of control. The Japanese were looking at saying, we don't want to track anything. We just want to poke-yoke it. So they were trying to design everything in as far as mistake proofing and so forth. Aerospace tried to borrow the models, but didn't know what they were doing because they tried to take tools that were for high volume, low value, and move it into high value, low volume, and tried to make that work. And so there are certain things that can work. There's certain things, but the tools need to be adapted. And again, it's sort of, it isn't just because it's a hammer, everything should look like a nail. So really it comes down to the fact of, a mindset of continuous improvement on a regular basis. And I could take you through another failure, and this one was actually kind of on a lean 5S. But I think that speaks to some of the reason for failure. It's not always necessarily just getting the managerial buy-in. We work for employee buy-in, and that's important. And it's important because of the fact that a lot of employees have this sort of, I guess you would say they're stuck in the fact of, well, why should we try this again? Because every month you've brought us something, and we're tired of programs of the month. We've seen it before. We've tried that, and we always ended up kind of back where we were. So I was doing a lean 5S sort of rollout in a factory, worked with got a group of grassroots individuals, multidiscipline, and we were doing a lot of really good work. We completely reconfigured an area. We took all the efficiencies out. We built this beautiful sort of, I guess you would say, model area, only to come in Monday morning one time and see the fact that the entire area, there was great big movers in there, and they were moving all the machines around and disconnecting everything. And unfortunately, we had a facilities director that while we were planning on a new machine, he never bothered to tell anybody that he was redesigning the area and could put the new machine in the middle. And it sort of destroyed the morale of the team. And so having them engaged, keeping everybody, both the peers, the upper level, I look at it sort of as my responsibility. I should have worked closer relationship with that peer to make sure that he wasn't going to do something like that. But to keeping everybody as buy-in is really important. But yeah, absolutely. So just a continuous improvement throughout the organization is the biggest thing.
Yeah, and I think we could get hyper focused when we're improving a process, and then it's always systems. Like this affects something else. You can't wash one thing without making something else dirty. So it's like you got to think, how does it trickle through? And in your case, you kept going and going, then all of a sudden, like it was obsolete the next day, or like what you were working on turned into something else, which I find interesting. And a lot of this too, though, is like soft skill, which I think we focus mostly on stats, but like understanding how the departments relate and how goal setting's done and communication happens. And one of my fails was a soft skill fail. We were working on, we had this machine there's like this huge roll of aluminum. It's like heater pipe material. It's like thousands of pounds. And this machine pulls it, straightens it, and then cuts it, pulls it, straightens, cuts it. And the lengths were varying. Well, so I'm like, well, I know how to do a fishbone diagram. Let's just call a meeting, have everybody come in. And so, of course, we have engineers, production. I always say, don't forget it's your safety people. Usually we forget about them and so on. We have everybody in there. And of course, the first thing engineering says, well, production doesn't know how to set it up right. We've given them directions. And production's like, well, engineering has all of the pressures wrong. And then it was quality's like, nobody's measuring it right. And so it was like, but not our fault. And so it was like finger pointing 101. And I didn't set any ground rules for the brainstorm. And I'm like, usually I skip over that when I'm like studying Six Sigma stuff. I'm like, oh yeah, that's the soft skill. I need to know like how does the deviation ANOVA work and all that. But so anyway, one of my fails was just not thinking about the soft skill stuff enough, which kind of ties into yours just in a different way, I think. I don't know.
No, absolutely. Um, I think another big fail that some people have is they get a very short term result and or none, and then they sort of give up and walk away. And so, if we were to draw a quick model of latency and momentum, So think about a diagram here where time is on your bottom axis, and on the vertical axis is really the result that you're looking for. So maybe you're looking for X improvement, and you're looking for time. There's a point in time where you're implementing something, and it's just the implementation phase. It's ramp up. You're actually trying to actually enact the whatever it is, the equipment or the methodology or whatever. And then there's a period of learning and kind of a learning growth curve. And then there's sort of this kind of settling in. And when it's done, what ends up happening is what we fail to realize is that there's a managerial or a facilitator push that's occurring during that time frame. And so at some point in time, once that's fully implemented and everybody's trained, two things happens. That facilitator or that manager is likely going to quit pushing because they're going to go over and work on the next thing. And at that point in time, some type of momentum has to take place. And that momentum is usually through buy-in. That momentum is usually through an experienced result and seeing and the soft skills and understanding that this is a good thing or that they want to keep going. And so one of the things you can actually see is a couple different paths that basically take place when you hit that level. One is as soon as everybody quits pushing, there's just a return to status quo because nobody's there continuing to push it, and everybody gravitates back because they never really bought in. So they gravitate back to what they were doing before. The other is that they can actually start to maybe keep it and it starts to take a life of its own. But there's also maybe through that, there's some kind of adaptation and maybe some kind of hybridization with the status quo. And so maybe you see some result, but it's not at the level that you kind of wanted. And or there could be the fact that it actually truly does take a life of its own, and it moves forward, and you see that there was full buy-in, and you got everything that you wanted. But within that latency model, I think it's important to start to track those and realize, was it truly the fact of the improvement that was good or bad, or was it just the fact that when that push quit, something basically went back to either a status quo or took on a different life? And so I think that the soft skills, to your point, is really important to sort of maturate those individuals into, their full own adoption, and whatever it is that they will do to carry that forward.
That reminds me, the old school Hawthorne studies back in our,
Right.
they were watched early and they kept messing with all of the, the environmental stuff, the heat or the lights or lunch breaks or this and that, but their productivity kept going because they were, there's this pressure. And then you pull the pressure off and it'll revert. That's where the control chart comes in, hopefully. Um, but yeah, so there's this, and again, this is just basic management theory. You're going to have like if you go back again to Lewin back however long ago, you unfreeze it, we're changing things, we're in the middle, we're changing it and we're pushing. And then when you refreeze it, you got to lock it in. And it's easy to not refreeze it because that's what our natural tendency is to move on to the next thing without locking the change in. I always say this is like with weight loss. Like every year I'm going to drop 15 pounds. It'll help my blood pressure and whatnot. And I get that 2 months of momentum and then it becomes challenging and I don't lock it in. And that's, I mean, essentially just what happens in organizations.
Yeah, so let's talk just a little bit about that locking in, because it's not necessarily always just at, I guess you would say what we know as maybe the operator or worker level where we're trying to get those buy-in. Um, let's think of just a minute about like a capital expenditure or a capex, and we all know that those are justified. Those purchases, you're taking a percent of net profit and you're basically bringing it back to reinvestment into the organization in some type of a capital expenditure, and those are usually defended um, on some type of an ROI. And so those return on investments, they're spelled out of, well, this thing is going to save me, um, you know, 4,000 hours of labor per year. And it's going to save me this. And so there is a forgivable latency, because in that forgivable latency, there is everybody basically probably overestimates a little bit the fact that that's going to happen on year one. And implementation took a little bit longer, the learning curve took a little longer, and so forth and so on. But at some point in time, how many organizations truly hold them accountable and go back in and say, okay, you said 4,000 hours of labor. The average worker is 2,080 hours in a year. So who are the two people that are no longer here? Who'd you send home? Who's gone? Did you take the labor out? Did you really? Because the honest answer is no. And if you take a look at your volume in the organization and you did not see the volume, you do not see actually year over year volume lift that those individuals went into, then the reality of it is you absorbed those into other inefficiencies elsewhere. You took them from direct clocked in labor somewhere and you put them into inefficiencies, and now you've got a new toy, but you've never taken the really responsibility for it. That's how those types of various improvements maybe do not hit that, did it drop to the bottom line? And the answer is quite honestly, a lot of times there's not the accountability. So some of that control has to basically be the fact that you're running like a 5 or 6 year minimum, probably more like a 3 to 10. You're running this kind of ongoing ledger of these improvements, and you're actually tracking them to the point where it's not just, I took credit for this year, close the books, we move to the next year. And eventually everybody all of a sudden 5 years later is sort of like, well, our bottom line didn't actually move that much. But we need to kind of constantly have the accountability back to all of those things that we said, track those latencies, keep our eye on that price.
Well, yeah, shifting to culturally, I was thinking, where does Six Sigma work best? Because like in the 80s, I would say, again, if we're going to stereotype generations, you're more likely to work for your employer longer. You could get a culture where people learn Six Sigma. It's not fat, you don't just take a class and that's it. Like it's a continual thing where today's job market, especially, people are more likely to job hop. It's really not lifelong employment. Where again, in Japan, you have more, especially, and again, I'm sure their culture is changing too, but back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's more lifelong employment. So this culture takes hold and takes root. When you're saying 6 year, let's say that you got to measure this over 6 years. What are the odds that even any of your managers or half of even your staff is still there? But the thing I would say though is a lot of this, since we have so many small businesses now, I think a lot of the Six Sigma stuff could help without being so formalized, more of these entrepreneurial mindseted people where they have everyone right under their control, if you will. It's actually easier to implement for a small business anyway. So I would say that is the shift. Again, I'm all over the place when I'm talking, and you can see me drinking coffee in the background. It's all good. But what are your thoughts on the culture shift from the 80s to today and the entrepreneur versus the long-term employment?
So I think a couple things. One is if you're, I guess if there's some accountability because you have these moving pieces to your point. Sometimes you even have moving points at the boss level. On the other hand, if your process or your books are set up in a way that's sort of like, it doesn't matter if Brad's trying to buy a new machine this year, and if, Mark bought the one 5 years ago, the reality of it is, everything that Mark bought for the last 4 years, he claimed this on his ROI, but he's never moved the needle on it. So, Brad, you're going to have to really work a lot harder to basically justify or get a machine from us. So there's sometimes some of that process accountability that transcends the particular head, if you would, or the name on the door. So that is still true. I do think you're right in many respects that some of the larger organizations are saying, let's continue to try to just have a more of an entrepreneurial and continuous improvement innovation, but not necessarily earmark the things as much. And some of the tools do work well for smaller organizations. I will say that those managerial changes and those direction changes, they can create balance, and they can build the toolbox out of best practices as we expose more individuals to an organization. But sometimes they lack the depth, and sometimes they lack continuity and follow through. And so we see a lot of, I just remember in one of my last companies, we had an individual, and he was all in on the shortest lead time possible because he believed that one of our biggest competitors was ourself, meaning if we just didn't have the product on the shelf, somebody may just choose to literally send the airplane back out with a reworked part or something else and not necessarily buy the new thing because they're just not going to wait 3 weeks. And so his was all about getting that lead time down to the point where it was available. And the next guy comes in and basically was all about exactly the opposite. He's like, we're going to build our own internal efficiencies. And so, we're not necessarily going to try to rock our efficiencies to have something in 2 weeks when our model's set up for 18, whatever. And so when you keep seeing those, I guess you would say, philosophical swings, it can actually change everything in an organization. And sometimes that chaos means that you never really got to follow anything clear through. So that's the downside, although you do get sometimes multiple ideas and some best practices into the organization.
All right. Well, to close this out here in a few minutes, I want to talk about, what are your thoughts on Six Sigma relevance in this AI world? But like, do you have any other fails that you've been a part of or that you've seen happen where it was like, hey, this sounded like a good idea. We're going to follow the Six Sigma process and it fell through, and what the lessons learned?
Yeah, well, I talked about a little bit like some of the buy-in, and then I also talked about some of like the old GE original days where it just didn't meet the bottom line. Some of the more recent and I think kind of typical things in that way is the fact that when you're starting to work a very specific Six Sigma project, um, could be a lean project, it could be any of these, and you're starting to go through a defined process and drill down. One of the biggest issues that I've seen and experienced is that when you start to get a steering team that has a specific idea and you start to get the people bought in and you start to move it forward, the project of the month is the biggest thing. You have to try to figure out how to get somebody because they've been exposed to we've seen it with TQM, we saw it with Six Sigma, we saw it with, and they'll start listing all of these different things that have come in and they start to chalk it up to program of the month. So they will follow you because they're being paid and they're there. And so they'll follow you. But to get the real buy-in means that they really have to be convinced. And so the biggest fault that I've personally had is that I listened to the detractors. So there's an old image that has this pond, and people are trying to get from the status quo to the new future, and so people are rowing across, if you would. And you've always got this like 10% that's the early adopter. They'll embrace it, they'll go, and they'll move. There's about 70% that are going to follow somebody. And so they're looking to see where the attention is going to be spent. And then you've got this 20% of basically that are going to be resist. And I used to spend too much of my time, and I can think of multiple instances where I have like names I can put on who I focused on the resisting. And it actually detracted from the process because people saw me spending time with those detractors, trying to convince them and so forth. And it was sort of like they chose a team and they chose the detractor. And so focusing on that squeaky wheel derailed my project. I've learned over time to basically almost ignore that 20% and give all my attention to the 10% early adopters and to try to get a larger momentum moving quicker. And so if I can leave us with anything, it's do not necessarily spend a lot of time with those detractors. Always listen just enough to see if you're truly missing something of value, but spend all your focus on those others because I can tell you very specific names. And I won't because somebody might listen to the show, but I could literally tell you exact names of who I was listening to as a detractor, and I ended up with greater fellowship moving that direction.
Yeah, I've actually had that problem even as a professor. Like I might have a few good reviews and then one really bad one. And then I think there's something to glean from the bad one, but then I don't want to live there
Right.
because it's like, but it's tough because there's always a critic. It was this thing that always helped me is being a critic's the world's easiest job and everybody qualifies. But there is something about a critic too that can help you. But yeah, that's again soft skill area. It's really hard when someone's saying, this isn't going to work and you keep hearing it and hearing it. It's hard not to, it's hard to just roll it, let it roll off. One thing I was thinking about here, I guess we could close this out, is where do you see Six Sigma today in this realm of AI? And I kind of see it like, again, back when I was in industry, it was like, oh, Minitab's going to save us. And we're going to mix that with like this, like, let's say we're measuring on the floor and it's going to live update. And again, back to culture, it reminds me of the Japanese showing the American guy, the Andon, and he's got like a red, yellow, and green flag from Ace Hardware. And he goes, here's how easy an Andon board is. Your assembly line's running green, needs something soon, yellow, red, shuts down. And of course, the American guy goes out and builds a multi-million-dollar board that looks like, it's like an NBA
Right.
scoreboard. And so we see all this technology keep getting implemented. So, mini tab or live feeds, and now you've got a dashboard that's live and you've got a dashboard. But at the end of the day, the heart of it is your process in control? I don't know if AI is going to make this worse or help. What are your thoughts?
I got to visit Audi last year, go through the factory tour over in Germany, and one of the things I was really impressed with is not just they don't just have just in time, they have just in sequence. So literally, they've got every single model. They have an SUV, and then they have a sedan, and then they have a hatchback, and everything else going down the same production line. There's no defined order, and but literally by the order that was put in and by the sequence, um, when they walk over to the just in time that like Toyota had, that's basically backed up from the supplier. Literally, if they're doing transmissions as an example, the next transmission that comes off is a manual exactly lined up with the car that's ready for it. The next one's an automatic, just exactly lined up for it. Everything is not only just in time, it was just in sequence. The amount of, I guess you would say, automation and work and sequencing and electronic data exchange with the suppliers and so forth is just phenomenal. But I think one of the next things that, where we can certainly look at with AI is where we have generative adaptation. And I think that that's really, really key. I was working in a company where we were doing plastic extrusion for aerospace components. And I went to one of the extrusion shows, and there was some new data analytics companies there specific for plastic extrusion. So you put these various detectors and sensors on the line, and it literally, if you change it from batch of resin A to batch of resin B, and all of a sudden, it's reading all of the different pressures, temperatures, speeds, all of the different things, types of change. It's checking the amperage load on the motor. It's checking all of these kinds of things, and it recognizes that change. But I think the next thing with AI is the fact that it can actually then start to make logical changes to your production, that adjust with that, so that you have a continuum of quality or something like that. Um, and then the other nice thing about that was they could actually tell, if you had increasing amperage loads over time and increasing motor temperatures and so forth, that can even feed back into, other data that says all of a sudden you sit down and you're doing your strategic plan for the year, and it's sort of like, how much capex do we need, and we've got this input that says we've got 4 impending motor failures over the next year because of their aging, because we've seen these increased amperage loads and so forth. I see us never having had more data than we've had today. We have never had more intel. And so as we've had more intel and as we have more data, now we just have tons of data, and it's not necessarily clean and it's not necessarily useful in some times. But what AI can do for us is it can start to filter that out into very defined, actionable things. And as we do that, the idea that that's generative, if it starts to equal this and this starts to equal this, then it programs the next step for us. And so I do think it will help in not only in production quality improvements. I think it will help with our strategy. I think it will help with a lot of our planning. And, is it going to take everybody's work for them? I think there's maybe some people have that fear. And I think that AI right now is running ahead of some checks and controls. But I think as we start to move into the next iterations of it, I think we're going to see us start to find out how that can actually truly help service. We do have to watch that we don't go to the old saying by Marx, believe it or not. And he said that at some point in time, if machinery takes a certain life, we may end up having to serve it as an alien power. And I think that's people's fear today. But I think it doesn't have to be that way. It's certainly something that can serve us, and I think it absolutely will be an enabler for Six Sigma.
So you think so? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Then should people still continue to do the Six Sigma training then in this world?
I think the fundamentals of it, I think the pieces of it, I think are still useful. I do not necessarily think that it should be trained and taught and put into the toolbox as here's the hammer, everything's a nail. People really need to recognize the fact that I would rather see us training OpEx, meaning operational excellence and a continuous improvement mindset, and then give them value analysis, value engineering, or VAVE, give them Six Sigma, give them Lean, give them 5S, give them all of these basically tools, and let them still continue to work those when they're appropriate for the circumstance, and try to understand what they truly do. I think that if we don't train it well, it can either be overused or it can, or like we said, it might not make the bottom line.